Well, good morning, everyone. Wherever you are, it's morning here. It is American Independence Day. It is July 4th, 2023. Hello to all my colleagues, my friends, my former students. Um, the previous video on ancient Egyptian had about 2,000 people look at it, which is good. And I was pretty much finished with that topic, which was provoked by the Netflix film Queen Cleopatra. I decided to do something else because something else came up. I was informed by a group that Zahi Hawass, who former head minister of antiquities in Egypt, was on a tour of the United States. And he was going all around the United States, city after city, and he was giving a kind of anti-Afrocentrist tour. And his last place on the tour was Boston, and this was on June 30th. I decided to go to his presentation, which was quite an undertaking. I had some people get in touch with me, and they said they wanted to do a demonstration. And I said, well, I would show up 2 hours early or whatever. The Hawass does not speak at universities. He speaks in very large hotels to non-academics. And we'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, I got to the hotel very early and walked around, and I didn't see anyone, and I had bought a ticket. I was very committed to hearing this person because my whole point of view is I hear all kinds of rumors about what people say. Well, so-and-so said so-and-so, and it's not true. They haven't said that. And so I really wanted to hear what this man had to say. I didn't want to read a press report or get something on the internet. I wanted to hear what he had to say. Now, the tickets were $1,000 down to $200. And so to be with you today and talk about what I'm going to talk about, I paid my $200. And I went into a huge and cavernous convention hall, huge ballroom, right? So I go in, and there are maybe seats for 2,000 people. There may have been 1,500 people there, and it was like a world I did not know. And what I mean by that is there weren't academics. These were not academics. Summer, people had their summer clothes on. There were a lot of pensioners. There were a lot of walkers. I can say that as a senior citizen. Lots of senior citizens. And the audience was the whitest audience I've seen since I've been back in the United States for 2 months. I looked around, and I was the only person of color. And I even stood up and did a video and said, they won't believe this, but this is amazing. A city like Boston. There were all these old white pensioners waiting to hear about the glories of Egypt, which somehow involved them. So I sat through a presentation which involved a lot of artifacts, and a lot of tourist talk. Come to Egypt, we'll take good care of you. Slogan was, Egypt is open for business, Egypt is safe. Dr. Hawass is a former government minister. He was a good friend of Mubarak. When Mubarak fell, he lost his job. He was briefly imprisoned. He's been accused of being a huckster, but he's back. And he was educated at the University of Pennsylvania. So I listened to the lecture, which was basically a lot of slides and a lot of video. I mean, it took maybe 20 minutes of a voiceover talking about the glories of Egypt and saying, you too can see the glories of Egypt. You can sail on a 5-star boat down the Nile, and we will stop, and you will have wonderful, wonderful food and wonderful hotels. There's no terrorism, and you can see these magnificent things that we have extracted from the ground. I mean, this would not be an academic lecture about the people. It was nothing about the dynasties, sort of Egyptian history. It was like all this good stuff. And it was all sort of mixed up. At some point, he said, well, this is, he didn't even say late, but this is a tomb. There was a small tomb. And this, he said, well, this is, has Greek on it, and it's from, the 7th century BC. This is one of the late Egyptian dynasties, but Egyptian, but using Greek mercenaries. But he didn't say that, because it's basically about things, beautiful things. And so I sat there, and there was nothing that I would, on the face of it, object to. No, I mean, seriously. I'm sitting there and saying, these are pretty things. And then he talks about, basically, what he was promising is, if you can see that, special access. And so if you went with him, because he's a government official, you would have special treatment. You wouldn't really come in contact with many Egyptians, but you would travel. It says, travel like a pharaoh. Now, no one spoke to me in this gathering, which I thought was strange. And I, being polite, said hello to my neighbor, who was a woman of a certain age with her daughter. And all she said to me is, have you been yet? And I said, well, I've been to Egypt. She said, oh, isn't it wonderful? And there was no malice. I mean, in a sense, it was, we're going to Disneyland. And it was marketed as Disneyland. And it didn't have people. There weren't pictures of Egyptians, or just pictures of things. Now, when the presentation was over, there were questions. And I said, well, said to myself, you have to ask a question. And so my question was, Dr. Hawass, in 2009, you were the guide for President Barack Obama during his Egyptian trip. And Obama jokingly said that one of the drawings on the inside of a temple looked like him. Now, that was joking, but it's also, that guy looks like me. And so I said, and also didn't have much time, but in the 1990s, 1990s, President Obama, or pre-President Obama, had taught in an Afrocentric school on the south side of Chicago. Wrote about it in his autobiography, Dreams from My Father, and talks about how this was important, how Egypt was important, and how he, and in his school, how he came in touch with people who taught it, and how invigorating it was. So all I said is, Dr. Hawass, as you know, ex-President Obama is an Afrocentrist. To which the reply was, Dr. Hawass got a little bit flustered, and he said, he's not a historian. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he said, there's a movement in this country, meaning in the United States, to say that the ancient Egyptians were black. They were not. They were neither blonde nor black. And at a certain level, I sort of understood him. I mean, there weren't a lot of blonde people running through the streets of Thebes or Memphis. So I understood that. And he said, also, ancient Egyptians were not black because the facial angle, he said the lips are different, the facial angle is different, and of course, the skin. Which is an interesting way of defining race because, That's probably true. There were people who looked like that in ancient Egypt. They probably weren't the majority, but also that's not the majority of African Americans. And he knows that. That's not Barack Obama. When Barack Obama said, I look like that sculpture, or I look like that drawing, he should have said, but that's not you. But as the man was the president, he didn't say anything. So years later, we have this debate, and he's saying, African Americans are mistaken. Apparently, the Egyptian government is now going to take measures to prohibit certain kinds of groups from having meetings in Egypt. There are a lot of people getting on planes and flying to Egypt and having meetings in places like Aswan, where people look like them. And that's one of the problems with air travel. People can get on a plane and go someplace, and no matter what you say, they can take selfies with people in the street. And your whole argument breaks down. So I'm glad I went. I understand Dr. Hawass, understand his reasoning, but also he doesn't quite understand how race is configured in the United States. African Americans, as Molefi Asante said years ago, are phenotypically, physically very, very, very varied people, but also culturally pretty homogeneous. But we should know this. It's not that hard to find. And I really wish that when Beyonce came in with her camera people and he had his camera people, that somehow, and this is my hope, it was that close that they would have allowed her to photograph, and someone would say, would you put on, could you dress up as an Egyptian queen? She looks much more like a pharaonic queen than some of the other people who tried to play the role over the years. But it didn't happen. She was asked to leave. Now, one of the things that's interesting about all this is colonialism producing its clone. And what I mean is that Egypt was a colony, semi-colony of the British from 1882 to 1952. And in that period, Egyptians were humiliated, they were mocked, and the ancient pharaonic Egypt was claimed as the heritage of the West, not of people like Dr. Hawass. Dr. Hawass is now in a program, it's very interesting, very Afrocentric program in a way. He's asking that the British Museum and the Louvre and the museum in Berlin all return materials sent to those countries in the 1800s. He's demanding it. He's also, and this sounds to me very Afrocentric, there's a statue in Paris of Champollion, the Frenchman who deciphered the Rosetta Stone, which has Greek and hieroglyphics, another kind of writing. Well, Champollion is standing, or is actually looking down, and he has his foot on the head of a statue of Ramses. And so Hawass said that this is insulting, it should be taken down, smashed up, whatever, and that also all the wonderful things that the Louvre has should be returned, and the British should return the Rosetta Stone. They have not replied, but he's saying all of this belongs to Egypt. Now, I think that's in a way good. That shows. I'm not saying it's going to go back, because I have a feeling that many museums are not going to send it back for reasons. And one of the reasons they say is security. But it means that Hawass is saying this, it means that modern day Egyptians are claiming pharaonic Egypt, which is important because for a long time they didn't. They did not. And so now in the 21st century, you find Egyptians, modern Egyptians saying, we are those people. Whereas in previous times, pharaonic Egypt was sort of cut off from modern Egypt. It had a different language, it had a different religion. The religion of the people, modern day Egyptians, sort of says that the period before the prophet was the Jahiliyyah, period of ignorance, people worshiping monkeys, bulls, etc., dabbling in magic, an immoral time. History begins with the prophet. That's true. Muslim calendar begins with the prophet. 632 AD in our time. So for a long time, Egyptians, saw people coming in and cutting things up and taking them away. It wasn't that important. I'm sorry. When I was in Egypt, I saw something which made me think about the value of things. There was an old clock tower down in the place where the palace of the rulers used to be, the 19th century rulers, not ancient rulers, but it was the modern palace, falling into disrepair. And there was an old clock tower that was all rusted and busted. And this had been a gift from the French government to the Khedive of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt. And it was in the 1830s. So he'd given this clock tower, which has utility. Clock towers, when they work, are very nice things to have. So he'd given this clock tower. The king of France had given a clock tower to the ruler of Egypt. And the ruler of Egypt, in return, had given him one of these old slabs of stone, which was an obelisk, which the French came and, or the locals cut up, would cut the base, put on a ship and sent to France. Now, you can say this is really a dumb bargain, but it's not. If you have a lot of these old things which come from a period of ignorance, which in a language you don't know, with a culture that is so far back that you're really not claiming it. And you have something of use, a clock, a big clock tower. Of course, now it's busted. It's rusted and busted. And someone might say, well, how, they should have kept these things. Well, for a long time, foreigners were allowed to come in and rape the antiquities of Egypt. The first, if King Tut and all that, King Tut was discovered in 1923. That's 100 years ago, by Carter, etc. And you look at the old movies, and what you see is a bunch of white people directing a bunch of brown people in jalabiyas and what they would call kaftans, directing them where to dig. And the people in charge are Europeans. And then this becomes theirs. They're finding it. They're taking it away. And the locals probably view it as they're making money. It is good for the local economy. They perhaps sort of knew that they're doing the really hard work of digging, excavating, under the instruction of these people, these foreigners, these Europeans. And the foreigners basically say they don't know what they have and they can't appreciate it. So therefore it is ours. This is well before Zahi Hawass. And so things are taken away. And the Egyptians, the modern Egyptians are low rated. What happens is there is a kind of denigration of modern Egyptians. Modern Egyptians are not the ancient ones. A famous 19th century anthropologist, he called himself the father of anthropology, I don't think he was, Sir Richard Burton, said the modern Egyptians are nothing more than whitewashed niggers. And there is this idea that basically they are a population which is degenerate. They may have been great once, but these are not the same people. And give you an example. This is an example that there was an episode, the Dinshaway episode of 1906. It might give us some idea of how far we've come. In 1906, a group of British officers are traveling down the Nile, and they're shooting. Sport of men, upper-class men. And they don't shoot people. They shoot pigeons. Now, they love it. pigeons are flying up. They shoot them. Now, these pigeons are being kept by local villagers. And the villagers are very upset with these Englishmen. And so there's an altercation but of course there's no common language. There's no translator with them. And so there's altercation. And in this altercation, one of the British men shoots an Egyptian woman. And she dies. And then one of the Englishmen runs away to get help and probably died of heat stroke. But one of the villagers goes to help him. He actually goes to help him and pick him up. But the British show up. The rest of the British show up as he's kneeling over the man, and they shoot him. Then the British decide to make an example of this place. And they hang a 17-year-old boy that they say is a ringleader. And they also provide, hand down prison sentences and the lash. The villagers are beaten publicly. They were out of their place. Egypt is a place where you go to see the sights and to hunt. And this is not good for tourism. These people are living their lives. They don't care much about old stones. They don't know British racism is reaching its height. And it applies to them. And in that racism, they say all of this stuff, the pharaonic stones and pyramids and obelisks belong to them. Now, I was looking for this talk with you to find out when the first Egyptian native archaeologists came along. And I found one in the late 1940s, around 1950. In 1952, this revolution, things become indigenous. So I assume in the post-World War II period, we have the entrance of Egyptian archaeologists, and they have to navigate both their own culture, which says some of this is, irreligious, this is pre-Islamic, but they have to navigate, and they do. And so you have new crops of indigenous Egyptians being the experts. I want to wrap up by saying that this whole controversy is not going to go away. It was very big. The Afrocentrist controversy about Egypt was big in the 90s, and then it sort of went away. It was a big thing. And there were articles in the New York Times, whole pages. There were books written, as I said last time. Then it sort of diminished. I remember when Barack Obama in 2008 was being nominated, there were two conservatives who went through his curriculum vitae and said he taught Afrocentrism in a school in Chicago. Will he be forcing this on the country? Well, he didn't. Okay, and the whole thing, you look at the number of articles published, etc., went down. Now it's back. Now I think we need to really deal with it and put it to bed finally. We need to deal with it now. So, may we have questions, please?
The first question is, why do you think white people were so interested in what this man had to say? Because you said you were the only person of color there.
Yes. I think that people in the West, especially in the United States, white people, believe, and they go to school, that history begins in Egypt or in Iraq, neither of which are white spaces now. And so it becomes very important to claim a kind of putative, a kind of imposed whiteness on the beginning. In other words, if you say, these were people of color, but this is the beginning of everything, that is a bit it makes some people nervous. Okay, that's my answer.
So the second question is, what do you think the impact of the museums giving the artifacts back would be on Egypt?
I think it would help tourism in Egypt. So I think part of it is to monetize this, get everything back in one place. And that's good for the Egyptian economy. As Professor or Doctor, not as Dr. Hawass kept saying, Egypt is open for business, Egypt is safe. So the question would be, could Egypt maintain these things? And I'm sure they would have security, huge security, and it would help the Egyptian economy. It would also mean, though, it was harder to get to. And so many people who in the West or the United States who go to museum, including Black people, if everything is removed from the museum, they'd have to go to Egypt. And Egypt has said it may in the future not permit Afrocentric groups going. So I think as an economic measure, if Egypt can protect these goods, fine. And if Egypt can promise that all people, regardless of race, can come and see them, then I'd be in favor. Next question.
The third question is, why do you think Afrocentrism is rising up again?
Okay. Why Afrocentrism has, why it rose and declined, but it's rising again, I think was that there were various movements to say, okay, look at other things that are happening. Look at your history in the United States. Look at the West African kingdoms. And so there were various proposals, very obvious. People wrote, we have to create another history. So books were written saying, well, the West African kingdoms that you come from, not necessarily, but this is more you. And then creating very elaborate narratives around slavery. Slavery is America's original sin, and that's what you have. There is in African Americans a desire, like everybody, to be somebody. And John Henry Clark, a famous Afrocentrist, probably would not approve of the 1619 Project because he said, if you start your history with slavery, everything will seem like progress. And so you had some people saying, we're getting lots of money being spent on stories of the horror, the peculiar horror of slavery in the United States, where less than 5% of the enslaved went. But eventually people want a story of triumph. And so popping up again, we have Afrocentrism. We had a whole period in which we had a lot of slave movies, a lot of rapes, a lot of castrations, a lot of lynching. And then people said, but we know that is not all our past. So that is why Afrocentrism is back. Well, I want to thank you for watching. I think the previous video had about 2,000 people viewing it. That was pleasant, and that was gratifying, more than pleasant. I've had a few people get in touch asking questions because they didn't see the video, which I can't really explain the whole video in a telephone call. But I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my very capable assistant and editor, Pedro, and I hope to see you soon again. Thank you.